Hey everyone, welcome back to English Inside Out.
What's up, guys? Good to have you here again.
So today's episode is one of my favorites. Because we're not talking about textbook English.
Yeah, we're talking about real English, the kind people actually use every single day.
Exactly, because I think this is one of the biggest frustrations for English learners.
For sure.
You study English for years. You learn grammar, vocabulary, maybe even advanced stuff. But then you watch a movie or talk to a native speaker and you're like, wait, what did they just say?
Yeah, because nobody talks like a textbook.
Nobody.
Like, you don't hear people saying, "Hello, how are you doing today? I am doing very well, thank you."
Exactly, that sounds polite, but not natural.
Right. Real conversations are messier, shorter, more relaxed, and full of expressions that you probably never learned.
So today, we're going to break down some of those expressions, things native speakers say all the time.
That might confuse you, even if your English is already pretty good,
And the goal is not just for you to understand them.
but to actually start using them.
Yes, because that's what makes you sound natural.
All right, let's jump into the first one.
Okay, this one is everywhere. Like, everywhere.
Oh yeah, you hear this all the time.
The expression is,
And here's the thing, it doesn't actually mean anything specific most of the time.
exactly. That's why it's confusing. So technically, should be used to clarify something, right?
Yeah, like if you want to explain what you just said,
But in real life, people use it for a bunch of different reasons.
like to organize their thoughts,
Or to soften what they're about to say.
or even just to buy time while thinking.
For example, it wasn't that bad.
Yeah, or, we could try that, but I'm not sure.
Or even when you're disagreeing. I mean, I don't think that's true,
Notice something here. When you say you're not really translating anything.
right? You're not saying "eu quero dizer" in a literal way.
Exactly. If you translate it, it sounds weird.
This is one of those expressions you just feel not translate. A lot of learners either don't use it at all.
Or they overthink it.
Yes, they're like, wait, when exactly should I use
And the answer is pretty loosely.
very loosely?
Like, imagine we're talking about a movie. It was okay. The story was a bit slow, but I liked the ending.
Yeah, that sounds supernatural. And notice how gives you a second to think.
Exactly. It makes your speech feel more human.
And this is something really important. Natural English is not perfect English.
Not at all.
It's full of pauses, fillers, little expressions like this.
And if you avoid them, you might sound too robotic.
So if you want to start sounding more natural, try this. Next time you speak, just add a simple
Even if it feels weird at first.
Yeah, it will feel weird. That's normal.
All right, that was a good start.
Yeah, and we've got a lot more expressions coming.
Some of these are going to surprise you. All right, the next one is another classic. And honestly, this might be even more common than "I mean." We're talking about, you know. And what's interesting about this one is that, again, it doesn't really mean what it looks like it means. Because if you translate it directly, it sounds like you're checking if the other person knows something, like you're asking a question. But most of the time, you're not actually asking anything. You're just keeping the conversation flowing. You're kind of inviting the other person into your thought process. It's almost like you're saying, "Hey, stay with me here. We're thinking together." And native speakers use this constantly, sometimes without even noticing.
Yeah, and I think this one is really important because it makes your speech feel more connected. When you say you know, you're not just throwing information at someone. You're kind of building a shared understanding. Like, you're assuming the other person gets what you're saying, or at least you're bringing them closer to your perspective. And that's something that doesn't usually get taught when you're learning English. You learn words, grammar, sentence structure, but nobody really teaches you how to sound like you're in a conversation instead of just delivering sentences. And does exactly that. It makes everything feel more natural, more human, a little less formal.
So let me give you a more real example, like something you'd actually hear in a conversation. Imagine I'm talking about work. Yeah, I've been really busy lately. A lot of meetings, deadlines. It's just been a bit overwhelming. Now, if you remove the sentence is still correct, but it feels flatter. With, you know, it feels like I'm talking with you, not just to you.
Exactly. And you also hear it a lot when people are explaining something more personal or emotional, like, I was just feeling kind of stuck, you know? Like, I didn't really know what to do next. And here, is almost like you're hoping the other person understands that feeling. It creates empathy.
Now, there's something important here. Learners sometimes avoid using you know because they think it's unnecessary, or maybe even incorrect. But the opposite is true. If you never use things like you know, kind of, your English might be correct, but it can sound too rigid, too perfect.
Yeah, and on the other side, some people start using it too much. Like, I was, going to the store, and then,
Ha 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 ha, yeah, that happens too.
so it's about balance. You don't need to force it, but you also shouldn't avoid it. Just let it come naturally as you get more comfortable speaking.
And honestly, this is something you only really pick up when you start listening more to real conversations. Podcasts, interviews, YouTube videos, you'll start noticing how often people use these small expressions. And once you notice them, you can start using them too.
All right, let's move to the next one, because this one is super interesting. Okay, so this one is actually two expressions, but they work in almost the same way, kind of, sort of. And what they do is very simple. They soften what you're saying. They make your sentence less direct, less absolute.
Yeah, and this is something that's everywhere in English, because native speakers don't always like to sound too direct or too certain about everything. So instead of saying something in a very strong, definitive way, we kind of soften it. And that's where kind of and sort of come in. For example, instead of saying, this is difficult, you might say, this is kind of difficult. And that small change completely changes the tone. It feels more natural, less aggressive, more conversational.
Yeah, and you can use it in so many situations. Like, I'm kind of tired. It's sort of weird. I kind of like it. And what's interesting is that sometimes you are sure but you still use, kind of just to sound softer. And this is something that's actually cultural. In English, especially in casual conversation, people often avoid sounding too strong or too absolute. So instead of saying, I hate this, they might say, I kind of don't like this.
Exactly. And if you don't use these softeners, sometimes you can sound a little too direct. Not wrong, just a bit stronger than intended. A common mistake is trying to translate kind of literally, because in some languages, that translation doesn't really exist in the same way.
Yes. So instead of translating, try to feel the purpose. It's not about the exact meaning, it's about the tone.
Let's do a quick natural example. Yeah, I watched that movie yesterday. It was kind of interesting, but I wouldn't watch it again.
Yeah, that sounds supernatural. And notice how kind of interesting actually gives a mixed opinion. It's not amazing, but it's not bad either. And this is something really powerful. These small expressions help you express nuance. Because real communication is not just good or bad, yes or no. It's usually somewhere in between.
All right, so we've got, kind of, sort of.
And we're just getting started.
All right, this next one is really interesting because it's extremely common, but also very misunderstood. We're talking about the word actually. And I've noticed that a lot of learners either overuse it or use it in a way that sounds a little off. Because when you translate actually directly, it feels like it should always mean something like na verdad. But in real conversations, it's a bit more flexible than that.
Yeah, and I think the key thing to understand about actually is that it's often used to correct, clarify, or adjust something in a very natural way. But it's not always as strong as naverdaji sounds in some languages. Sometimes it's very soft, almost subtle, and that's why tone matters so much here, because depending on how you say it, actually can sound helpful. Or a little confrontational.
So let's look at a simple example. Someone says, this place closes at 9. And you respond, actually, I think it closes at 10. Now you're correcting them, but in a relatively polite way.
Right? And you can also use it when you're adding new information, not just correcting. For example, I didn't like the movie at first, but actually, the ending was really good. So here, you're kind of adjusting your opinion as you speak.
And sometimes, actually is just used to introduce what you really think, especially if it's slightly different from what the other person expects. Like, actually, I prefer staying home. It's not aggressive. It's just a gentle shift.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of learners get it wrong. Because if you stress it too much, like, actually, it can sound like you're disagreeing strongly or correcting someone in a harsh way.
Another thing I see a lot is people starting every sentence with actually. Like, actually, I went to the store. Actually, I like pizza. And it doesn't always fit.
Exactly. Because actually should have a reason to be there. You're either correcting, clarifying, or slightly changing direction. If none of that is happening, it can sound unnecessary. So a good way to think about it is this. Use actually when there's a contrast, even a small one,
Yeah, like you're adjusting the conversation just a little bit.
all right? Now this next one is probably one of the most iconic things in spoken English. Okay, let's talk about and I already know. Some people are going to hear this and think, oh, isn't that bad English?
Yeah, a lot of people think that.
But the truth is, everyone uses and not just teenagers, adults, professionals, native speakers, it's everywhere.
Yeah, and what's important is understanding that like has different functions. It's not just one thing. Sometimes it's used as a filler, sometimes to give examples, sometimes to approximate something. One very common use is when you're trying to estimate or approximate something. For example, it was like 10 minutes away. I spent like $50. You're not being exact, you're just giving a rough idea.
Yeah. And another very common use is when you're telling a story so I was walking down the street and this guy was like, hey, excuse me. And then I was like, oh, sorry.
Yeah, and in that case, like is introducing what someone said, but in a more casual storytelling way.
And then there's another use that's a bit more subtle. Sometimes, like is just there to give you a second to think, or to make your sentence feel more relaxed. For example, I was just, really tired.
Exactly. And if you remove it, again, the sentence is still correct, but it feels more formal. Now, of course, you don't want to overuse it too much, because if every sentence is like, I was like, and then it can sound a bit messy.
Yeah, but here's the important part. Don't try to eliminate it completely, because then your English can sound too rigid again. I think this is one of the biggest mindset shifts. A lot of learners think that good English equals perfect, clean, structured sentences. But real English is imperfect. It's fluid, flexible, sometimes a little messy, and that's what makes it natural.
Yeah, and like is a big part of that. It makes your speech sound more relaxed, more real, more human. All right, so now we've covered a bunch of these small expressions.
And hopefully, you're starting to see a pattern here.
All right, this next one is super small, but incredibly powerful. We're talking about the word just. And I think this is one of those words that learners usually understand, but don't fully use the way native speakers do. Because when you learn just, you probably learn meanings like apenas, so, or akabude. But in real conversations, it goes way beyond that.
Yeah, and what makes just so interesting is that it often doesn't change the literal meaning of a sentence that much. But it completely changes the tone. It can make something sound softer, more polite, less intense, or even more natural. For example, instead of saying, I need help, you might say, I just need a little help. And suddenly, it feels less demanding.
Exactly. Or instead of saying, wait a second, you say, just wait a second. It feels calmer, more casual. And one thing I've noticed is that just is often used to minimize something, even when it's not actually small. Like, I'm just a bit tired. I just wanted to ask something. And sometimes, you're not just a bit tired, you're exhausted.
Yeah, but you don't want to sound too strong, so you soften it. And this is very common in English. People often reduce the intensity of what they're saying to sound more polite or more relaxed.
A mistake I see a lot is learners using just only in very literal contexts, like, I just arrived, which is correct, but very limited.
Yeah, and they miss all these subtle uses that make their English sound more natural. So if you want a simple tip, start adding just when you want to sound softer or less direct.
Yeah, it's a small word, but it makes a big difference.
All right. Now this next one is another word that looks simple, but is used in a very specific way in spoken English. Okay, so most people know pretty as meaning bonito or bonita, right? But in everyday English, pretty is very often used as an adverb, and when it's used like that, it means something like quite, fairly, kind of.
Yeah, and this is extremely common. You'll hear people say things like, "It's pretty good. I'm pretty tired. That was pretty interesting." And what they mean is, not very, not extremely, but somewhere in the middle.
So if you say, it's good, gives neutral. It's very good, gives strong. But if you say, it's pretty good, it feels more natural, more conversational, less intense.
Exactly. And this is something that makes your English sound more balanced, because real conversations are full of these middle-level expressions. Not everything is amazing, not everything is terrible. Most things are just pretty good.
For example, how was the restaurant? It was pretty good. I liked the food, but the service was a bit slow.
Yeah, that sounds very natural. And notice how pretty allows you to give a positive opinion without sounding exaggerated. Some learners either don't use pretty at all, or they confuse it with very and expect it to have the same strength.
Yeah, and that's important. Pretty is softer than very. It's more relaxed, more conversational. So if you want to sound more natural, replace very sometimes with pretty.
Yeah, instead of saying, "I'm very tired," try, "I'm pretty tired." It sounds way more natural in everyday conversation. All right, so now we've covered quite a few of these expressions.
And if you start paying attention, you'll notice that native speakers use them constantly.
All right, this next one is really interesting because it's not just about language, it's about tone and intention. We're talking about honestly or to be honest. And at first, it seems very straightforward. You might think, oh, it just means honestamente. But in real conversations, it's doing something a bit more subtle.
Yeah, because when you say honestly or to be honest, you're not just stating a fact. You're signaling that what you're about to say is more real, more personal, or maybe even slightly uncomfortable. It's like you're lowering the filter a little bit. For example, to be honest, I didn't really like it. That sounds very natural, and it prepares the other person for a more genuine opinion.
Yeah, and it can also be used when you're admitting something, like, honestly, I haven't been very consistent with my English lately. That feels real. It feels personal. And I think this is why it's so common, because conversations are not just about information. They're about connection. And when you say honestly, you're kind of opening up a little more.
Exactly, it adds a layer of authenticity. Even if what you're saying isn't super dramatic, it feels more meaningful. One thing to be careful about is overusing it. Because if every sentence starts with, honestly, to be honest, it starts to lose its impact.
Yeah, and sometimes it can even sound like you're about to say something negative all the time.
So a good way to think about it is, use it when you want to emphasize sincerity, not just randomly.
Yeah, save it for moments that actually feel honest.
All right. Now this next one is something you'll hear a lot in conversations, especially when people are giving opinions or reflecting on something. Okay, so this expression might sound a little long, but it's actually very common. At the end of the day, and what it really means is something like when everything is considered in the final analysis.
Yeah, it's basically used when you want to summarize your main point, or what really matters in a situation. It's like stepping back and saying, all right, what's the bottom line here? For example, at the end of the day, it's your decision. So you're saying, after everything we discussed, what matters is your choice.
Or, at the end of the day, we just want to feel comfortable speaking English. And that brings the conversation back to the core idea. This expression is very common when people are explaining opinions, especially in longer conversations, because it helps organize your thoughts and highlight what's most important.
Yeah, it's almost like a conclusion, but in a very natural spoken way. Some learners avoid expressions like this because they feel too long or too advanced.
But actually, they're very common in everyday speech. So if you want to sound more natural in longer conversations, start using expressions that help you structure your ideas, not just individual sentences.
Yeah, because speaking naturally is not just about vocabulary. It's about how you connect your thoughts. All right, we've covered a lot today.
Yeah, and if you think about it, none of these expressions are complicated.
You know what's interesting about all of this? None of the expressions we talked about today are difficult. Like, there's nothing here that's advanced grammar or complicated vocabulary. But at the same time, these are exactly the things that make the biggest difference in how natural you sound.
Yeah, and I think that's something a lot of learners don't realize at first. Because when you're studying English, you tend to focus on big things. You focus on learning new words, memorizing rules, understanding tenses. And all of that is important, of course. But then you get to a point where you can technically say what you want, and it still doesn't feel natural.
Exactly. And that's where these small expressions come in. I mean, you know, kind of, just, pretty, like, they don't carry the main meaning of the sentence, but they completely change how the sentence feels.
Yeah, they're almost like the glue of the language. They connect ideas, soften things, give you time to think, make you sound more relaxed, and without them, your English can sound correct, but a little stiff. And I think this is also why so many people feel stuck, because they reach a level where they understand a lot. But when they speak, it feels like something is missing.
Yeah, and sometimes that something is not more vocabulary, it's not more grammar, it's just learning how people actually talk.
Exactly, and that's a different kind of learning. It's not about memorizing, it's about observing, listening, and slowly incorporating these patterns into your speech.
And also being okay with sounding a little messy at first.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Because natural speech is messy. People pause, repeat themselves, use fillers, change direction mid-sentence. And that's completely normal.
So if you're waiting to sound perfect before you start sounding natural, that moment is probably never going to come. So maybe here's something simple you can do after this episode. Don't try to use everything we talked about today. That's too much.
Yeah, that's overwhelming.
Instead, just pick one expression. Maybe it's I mean, or you know, or kind of, and just try to use it in your next conversation.
Even if it feels a little awkward at first.
Yeah, it will feel awkward. That's part of the process.
But the more you use it, the more natural it becomes. All right, I think that's a good place to stop for today.
Yeah, this was a really good one.
And honestly, this is the kind of stuff that can really change how you speak, if you actually apply it.
Exactly. So don't just listen, try to use it.
And if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to stick around. We've got more coming.
And we'll keep breaking down real English. From the inside out.
See you next time.
Bye, guys.